Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. We all know that life doesn't always go as we expect, and sometimes the truth is stranger than any fiction we could imagine. Today's story is a clear proof of that. Before we get into the mystical details, I'd like to thank all of you who have been following us for a long time, who love strange, dark, and mysterious stories. If you're a fan of the strange and enjoy discovering stories that make you think and wonder about the limits of truth, then you've come to the right place. This is the space for those who love the paranormal, where we share a new story every week. And if you haven't joined yet, don't forget to like these stories, just like when you enjoy a batch of fresh donuts. But instead of filling them with custard, you try an unexpected topping mayonnaise. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future mystery stories. Get ready, because today we're going to explore a story that will leave you in awe. The story begins on a quiet afternoon on July 18, 1997. A man was driving down a small, wooded rural road in Douglas County, Wisconsin. There were no other cars on the road, and the atmosphere was quiet and somewhat mysterious. The man, sensing the peace, accelerated a little. The road wound around him, and as he approached a curve, something caught his eye outside the passenger window. On the side of the road, in the tall, dense grass, a large, looming object emerged. It was prominent enough to catch his attention, but not clear enough for him to identify what it was. Curiosity began to take over. He continued driving, trying to shake the thought of the strange object from his mind. But to no avail. Something compelled him to stop. "It's probably just a broken tree," he told himself, but his instincts told him it wasn't that simple. Deciding he couldn't ignore the anomaly, he slowed down, pulled the car over to the side of the road, and stopped. Stepping out of the car, he felt a rush of cool afternoon air. It was so quiet that the only sound he could make was his footsteps and the wind gently rustling the trees. He turned and walked along the road, getting closer to the object. As he got closer, he tried to peer through the thick grass, but the object remained obscured. Each step brought him closer to the answer. Bit by bit, the large object came into view. A chill began to spread through his body as he realized that, whatever it wasn't something that would normally appear on the side of a small country road like this. The man continued walking, and the distance was now only about 20 or 30 feet. Finally, the strange object came into view. He stopped short, unable to believe what he was seeing. It was not an inanimate object as he had expected. It was a man. This man was dressed entirely in white vest, white belt, white shoes, all white. He was lying on his side, motionless, right on the side of the road. At first, the driver thought that maybe this man was just sleeping, but his instincts told him something was wrong. He took a few more steps, this time close enough to see clearly without any obstruction. He froze when he noticed a horrifying detail. There was a large hole in the man's chest. There was no doubt that the man in white was dead. Panicked, the driver turned and ran back to his car. His heart pounded as he hit the gas, driving to the nearest house to call 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen sat at his desk. Before him were crime scene photos, images of a man in a white suit lying motionless on the side of the road. The murder had occurred less than 24 hours earlier, but it had quickly become one of the strangest cases he had ever worked on. The victim was identified almost immediately, thanks to the identification the man had carried. His wallet contained his driver's license and other documents. This made the identification easy, but it didn't answer the most important question: why was he there? And who had done this grisly death? Detective Stephen stared at the photos, trying to piece together the details. An uneasy feeling rose in his stomach. A well-dressed man, dressed entirely in white from head to toe, is mysteriously murdered in the middle of nowhere. This seems to be more than just a routine murder. The victim has been identified as Mark Foster, a 45-year-old millionaire who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, more than a 3-hour drive from the crime scene? But instead of clarifying the case, Mark's identity only adds to the mystery. Mark has no apparent connection to the Douglas County area. No one knows why he was there, in an unfamiliar rural area, dressed entirely in white, and brutally murdered on the side of a remote road. Detective Stephen can't help but wonder, why would a wealthy man like Mark end his life this way? Things only get more complicated when the medical examiner performs an autopsy. While examining Mark's body, the doctor discovers something strange, a note hidden in his shoe. On the note, it read, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or someone who looks exactly like me. Hope I'm okay now." The note's contents were completely cryptic, and even Detective Stephen couldn't decipher what it meant. But when the investigation team ran a police database search for the names Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, they made a crucial discovery. Both names actually existed. Jack Frazier was a man with a criminal record involving fraud and illegal trading, but had disappeared from the police's radar for many years. Jimmy Bailey, on the other hand, had no criminal record, but was a mysterious figure with very little personal information. The cryptic words on the note, along with the appearance of these two names, added to the mystery. Detective Stephen sensed that behind Mark Foster's death, there was a twisted and dangerous story waiting to be unraveled. Detective Stephen went to the Minneapolis police station and met with the local detective who was in charge of assisting the investigation. After a few brief greetings, the two entered the interview room, where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. This woman was much younger than Mark, perhaps 15 to 20 years old. She was pregnant, with a large belly, indicating that she was close to giving birth. Despite her grief and hardship, Mark's wife appeared calm, even seemingly accepting of the fact that her husband was dead. Detective Stephen observed the woman closely, paying attention to how she responded and reacted to the situation. She said that she had been informed of Mark's death the night before and had come to answer any questions that might help the investigation. Stephen began the interview. "We are sorry for your loss. I understand that this is difficult, but we were hoping that you could help us shed some light on what happened to your husband. First, do you know why Mark was in Douglas County, Wisconsin at the time?" She shook her head, replying calmly, "No, I don't know. He travels a lot, but he never mentions going to Wisconsin. It's strange because he always tells me everything." The detective continued, "Have you heard of these two names? Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey?" She looked confused for a moment, then replied, "Jack Frazier sounds familiar, but I don't remember exactly. As for Jimmy Bailey, I've never heard of him." Her answer didn't clarify much, but it confirmed that Jack Frazier might be related to Mark. Detective Stephen pressed further. "Has Mark ever mentioned any recent troubles? Like financial problems, threats, or conflicts with someone?" She shook her head again. "No, everything seemed normal. He didn't seem worried or stressed. In fact, he was very excited about being a father." The interview dragged on for a while, but nothing really broke. Mark's wife didn't seem to be hiding anything, but she didn't offer any major clues. However, as he left the room, Stephen felt that something in her answers, or in the whole situation, still wasn't quite right. Stephen decided that learning more about Jack Fraser and Jimmy Bailey, along with a closer look at Mark's relationship, might be the key to solving this mystery. The detectives sat down across from Mark Foster's wife, their eyes searching her every expression. The room was so quiet that only the sounds of pens and paper and the breathing of those present could be heard. They started with the usual questions, but as soon as one of the detectives mentioned the note found in Mark's shoe, the atmosphere became heavier. "We found a note in Mark's shoe," the lead detective said, his voice even but firm. There were two names on it, Jack Fraser and Jimmy Bailey. As soon as those two names were spoken, her expression changed. Her eyes widened, and then she bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. Within seconds, she was sobbing. "Jack! Jimmy!" she muttered between sobs, her hands covering her face. "You know these two?" another detective asked, more seriously. She nodded, struggling to control herself enough to speak clearly. "I know them. I had relationships with both of them before I married Mark." The answer silenced the detectives for a moment. One detective jotted down her words in his notebook. "After I chose Mark, Jack and Jimmy were very angry," she continued, her voice choking. "They couldn't accept that I rejected them. I always felt they were jealous of Mark. Maybe that's why they always had this hatred for him." She paused, wiping away her tears, but her eyes were still filled with pain. The detectives exchanged glances, realizing the importance of this testimony. The interview ended quickly, and when Mark's wife left, the detectives sat down to analyze. "Although this case seems strange," one detective said, "the real motive is probably quite simple. If Jack and Jimmy were so jealous of Mark, it's possible that they did it. We need to verify," the lead detective said. "The note in Mark's shoe was not a coincidence. It was a direct indictment, or a distraction. We need to find out more." With Jack Fraser and Jimmy Bailey cleared, Detective Long felt his original theory crumbling. But instead of being discouraged, he was determined to learn more about Mark Foster, believing that the answer lay in the victim's life and environment. On July 29, Detective Long and his partner showed up at Mark's two-story house. It was a large house, peaceful and typical of a suburban neighborhood. From the outside, everything seemed perfectly normal, as if nothing unusual had happened. They knocked on the door, and within seconds, Mark's wife opened the door. She looked exhausted, with puffy eyes and a tired expression on her face. "Please come in," she said, trying to be polite. Upon entering, Detective Long noticed a strange atmosphere pervading the house. The first floor was filled with graphic paintings and nudes hanging along the walls. These paintings were not ordinary art. They were filled with dark emotions and strange nuances. The most prominent large painting depicted a man sitting in darkness, surrounded by vague figures with burning eyes. Other paintings showed disfigured bodies or unclear but disturbing scenes. Detective Long felt uncomfortable but remained professional. "This house is not what I expected," he said to his colleague, his eyes scanning the paintings. Mark's wife stood nearby, seemingly reluctant but still trying to explain. "Mark likes art. These paintings are part of a collection he's been working on for years. He says they help him express his emotions." Further into the house, Long found Mark's office. On the desk, a black-covered notebook stood out amid the clutter of papers. When Long opened it, he saw handwritten notes, some messy, some clear, but all of them suggesting an unstable mental state. "The darkness keeps haunting me. I know I don't have much time left. They will come for me, but I have to keep it a secret." "What is this?" his colleague asked as Long flipped through the pages. "Maybe it's a clue," Long replied, carefully placing the notebook in an evidence bag. They continued upstairs, where things got even stranger. A sealed room with thick curtains drawn. When the door was opened, a series of strange images and objects were revealed. Strange figurines, a notebook with blurred writing, and several photos of Mark with unidentified people. The house was more than just a place to live. It was also a treasure trove of secrets about the real Mark Foster. Long had a clear sense that there was a bigger story hidden behind these walls, and he needed to uncover every detail to find the truth. After searching through the bedrooms and other areas on the second floor, the two detectives found that pornography was everywhere. What they found downstairs seemed to reflect the strangeness of this house. Back in the main hallway, they discovered a rope hanging from the ceiling, attached to a sliding door leading to the attic. They pulled the rope, revealing a set of folding stairs leading up. Without hesitation, the two began to climb. However, when they entered the attic, they realized that this was not a storage space, as is often seen in American homes. Instead, the attic had been transformed into a mysterious space, like a spooky dungeon. The walls were pitch black, candles were scattered everywhere, and tarot cards were strewn across the floor. In the far corner of the attic, they saw a strange altar that seemed to dominate the entire room. On the altar, there were more candles, a haunting voodoo doll, and many other strange objects. The two detectives looked at each other, unable to hide their confusion and concern. They cautiously approached the altar. When they were close enough to see clearly, they both froze. On the altar, among the creepy objects, were two business cards their own. Spotify Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs after discovering the unusual thing in the attic. They confronted Mark's wife, asking her to explain about the attic room and why their business cards appeared on the altar in this house. Mark's wife, her face pale, refused to answer any questions related to the attic. Her silence made the atmosphere even heavier. After a minute of realizing that this interrogation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner decided to call for backup. In the meantime, they left Mark's wife to talk privately. "What do you think?" Long spoke up, looking at his partner. "Could this be a cult? Is Mark a member? Or is he running it from that attic? And are we being targeted? Is there another reason why our names appear on that altar?" The unanswered questions made them even more wary. A few minutes later, backup arrived. Together, they conducted a thorough search of the house. However, aside from finding a large amount of pornography and bondage gear, there was no other evidence that linked Mark or his wife to anything shady or criminal. The attic, which was supposed to be kept secret, remained a mystery. There was no evidence that could be found that clearly linked it to the activities of a cult or what had happened to Mark. The story became even more ambiguous, leaving many questions that even Detective Long could not answer. After leaving Mark's house, Detective Long and his partner were puzzled by his wife's strange silence. They could not be sure if she was hiding something or simply afraid of a potential threat. But whatever the reason, they told her not to leave town and insisted that they would return to continue the investigation. Sensing that the answer might involve a cult, the two decided that they needed to consult an expert in the field. Just then, they remembered that there was an occult bookstore just a few blocks from Mark's house. It was rumored to be a reliable source for those studying mysterious rituals and cults. It didn't take long for them to reach the bookstore. The old wooden door creaked as it was pushed open, and inside was a space filled with shelves of antique books. The smell of old paper mixed with something like sandalwood. The man behind the counter, the owner, had a knowledgeable look and sharp eyes. When the detectives explained why they were there, he smiled and said, "You're lucky. Not only am I a cult researcher, but I also know Mark Foster. The statement stunned both of them. They immediately asked more, and the bookstore owner revealed that Mark often came here, especially to look for books on ancient rituals and documents related to secret beliefs. He also said that Mark never came alone. He usually came with a few friends who shared the same interests. The bookstore owner not only provided information about the cult, but also gave them a list of names. These are people I know who have come here with Mark. They might be able to help you with your investigation. Detective Long accepted the list, feeling that this was a valuable clue. They left the bookstore feeling like they were getting closer to the truth, but they couldn't deny that things were getting more and more mysterious. The list might be the key, but it could also open a door to unexpected dangers. There were still many unanswered questions, and the two knew they were just getting started. Mark Foster's associates, mostly young men in their 20s, quickly became the focus of the detectives' investigation. In each interview, they openly admitted that Mark was part of a cult to which they all belonged. Although the detectives suspected that the group might be a cult with dubious activities, the members insisted on calling it a cult, avoiding the negative stereotypes often associated with the word cult. The group appears to have secretive activities centered around strange ideas and rituals. While Mark's associates have not revealed many details, they seem to imply that the group has an organizational structure with core members and an unidentified leader. The presence of this group in Mark's life, as well as the extent of their influence on him, has led detectives to theorize that the group may have been directly or indirectly involved in the events that occurred in Mark's home. Recognizing the importance of understanding the nature and role of this group, detectives continue to probe each member to get to the core of the matter. Mark is a freelance journalist who became curious about a group he came across while investigating a story about extremist religious communities. The group called itself the Torch of Light, an organization that outwardly emphasized enlightenment and harmony, but on the inside, it hid much darker secrets. Greg says that Mark tried to infiltrate the group to learn more, even attending some of their secret meetings. However, when Mark began asking too many questions and trying to get close to those in leadership positions, he attracted unwanted attention. Greg describes how the higher-ups in the group felt that Mark was a threat. One night, Mark was invited to a special ceremony. According to Greg, it was not a regular ceremony, but a ritual held to deal with the intruder, Mark himself. Greg claims that he was not present at the ceremony that day, but heard from another member that things had gotten out of hand. Mark was treated roughly and eventually murdered, not because they wanted him to, but because they feared he would reveal their secrets. Greg believes that some members of the group acted without the approval of any of their leaders, but this only added to the chaos and fear within the organization. When the detectives asked further, Greg could not provide the exact location where the ritual took place, but he recalled an old farmhouse where the group often gathered. Greg also provided several names of people he believed might be directly involved in the incident. This information gave the detectives a major breakthrough in the case, but the big question remained: was Greg really just a bystander, or did he also have a deeper role in what happened to Mark? On July 18, 1997, Greg Ferner met Mark Foster at Mark's house. Mark was dressed head to toe in white, a characteristic he often wore when attending his special events. The story begins when Mark walked down the steps without saying a word and walked to Greg's car. Greg got into the driver's seat while Mark took the back seat. They drove northeast in silence for several hours. Greg focused on driving, while Mark just sat there, quietly looking out the window. The highlight of this trip happened when Mark took a piece of paper from his coat pocket, wrote something on it, and smiled mysteriously. He folded the paper and put it in his shoe as if it had some special meaning. After driving for a while, Greg stopped on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on a remote road. This action seemed to be the beginning of a more mysterious event, but the story stopped there, leaving a creepy and curious feeling about what would happen next. After stopping without exchanging a word, Greg and Mark both got out of the car and walked to the back of the car. Neither of them seemed rushed or nervous, just a seemingly pre-planned sequence of actions. Greg opened the trunk, and inside was a rifle. Neither of them reacted strongly to the presence of a weapon. Greg simply bent down, took out the rifle, while Mark quietly walked across the street. To the other shoulder, he stood there, waiting, and Greg slowly walked over, standing right in front of Mark. The two men looked at each other, their eyes meeting as if they were communicating something without words. Mark kept his composure, then nodded slightly, an unmistakable sign of agreement. Greg raised the rifle, the barrel aimed directly at Mark's chest. Without hesitation, Greg pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out dryly in the quiet space. Mark fell to the ground, his body curled up in pain. He let out a weak groan, the desperate sound quickly fading into the air, leaving Greg standing there, holding the gun like a man admitting the undeniable. Greg just stood there, silently watching Mark fall to the ground. He watched as Mark's last breaths slowly faded away until there was no more sound. When everything became quiet, Greg calmly returned to the car, showing no sign of panic or regret. He got in and started driving home. On the way back, Greg stopped only once, at a bridge over a river. Without hesitation, he threw the rifle into the water below, leaving it to disappear into the dark water. As he returned to the car, Greg felt a strange excitement rising inside him. He knew that what had just happened was not an ordinary murder, but a perfectly orchestrated sacred ritual. Mark Foster, who had just fallen from Greg's gun, was not just an ordinary member of that mysterious cult. He was the leader, the one who led the group with its bizarre beliefs and rituals. What was more special was that Mark himself had planned his own death. In the cult's beliefs, death was not an end but a sacred crossroads, a turning point, a change in spiritual awareness. Mark did not see death as a loss as society usually sees it. For him, it was a moment to celebrate, a door to a higher state of existence. In the cult's philosophy, life and death were intertwined like two sides of a coin, and only by experiencing death could one achieve true spiritual awakening. Greg, who was chosen to perform this ritual, felt honored to be entrusted with such a great task. For him, this event was not an act of murder, but the fulfillment of a sacred promise. Do you want me to continue the story of what happened after Mark's death, or delve into the secrets of the cult? Mark Foster, in his superstitious and faithful mind, believed that the sacred ritual he had just performed on Greg was not only a rite of passage of power, but also the key to achieving immortality. According to his beliefs, when Greg pulled the trigger, shooting a gun into his chest, not only would his physical body end, but his soul, consciousness, and spiritual power would transfer to Greg. Mark believed that his soul would never disappear, but instead would continue to exist within Greg, merging with his being. Mark even envisioned that his spirit could be passed on to other believers in the future, keeping his consciousness alive for generations. This was the ultimate goal of the ritual, not death but continuity, a form of eternal existence in their faith. Before the ritual took place, Mark made careful preparations to ensure that Greg, who had become his spiritual heir, would not be implicated. He wrote a small note, carefully tucked into his shoe, intended to mislead the police and protect Greg from arrest. The note was designed to indicate that Mark's death was not a routine murder, but a voluntary one, an act in line with his deeply held beliefs. In the note, Mark could have written a false story or even used ambiguous language to make the reader believe that he was the victim of an accident or a situation unrelated to Greg. This shows the level of trust Mark placed in Greg, as well as his willingness to sacrifice himself to complete the ritual. Mark wrote on his note naming Jack Fraser and Jimmy Bailey. These were two people he deeply hated. He hated them because they had had relationships with his wife, and he also believed that they hated him. This gave Mark the idea that if he needed to find a scapegoat for the murder he was planning, no one would be more suitable than two people he considered rivals in love. However, Jack and Jimmy had nothing to do with this case. Mark's inclusion of their names in the note was only to cause trouble for them. Even the pornographic and bondage objects found in the well at Mark's house were linked to his cult. The cult believed that regular sexual intercourse with multiple people at the same time would give Mark spiritual power and increase his power in the eyes of his followers. The detective's business card found on the altar in Mark's attic was likely placed there by the cult members themselves in an attempt to thwart the investigation. They may have believed that performing rituals and placing strange objects would help prevent the detective and investigators from getting closer to the truth. The case is closed, but questions continue to swirl. Those involved in the case, especially Greg Frainer, have faced their own judgment. He has no way of denying his role in Mark's death, although many of the murky elements surrounding the death have never been clearly resolved. Everything seems to be just hypotheses, unprovable theories, and all based on speculation about why he was at the scene. Mark was dead, and yet his wife, the only woman who could have known what was going on in the family, was never charged with anything. She had had some involvement with the cult, perhaps even participated in its activities, but there was no evidence that she had any direct connection to Mark's death. All detectives could do was investigate the inconsequential clues and the details that had no legal value. The end of this case not only brings those involved to account, but also makes people reflect on the nature of truth, on what can happen when evidence is not accepted or when there is not enough evidence. Greg Frainer's story is just part of a strange chain of events leading to irreconcilable contradictions between people, reason, and things we cannot understand. Like the American submarine Latu, perhaps no one really understands what happened below the surface. While Warrant Officer Augustine Grant was preparing to order the attack, what he witnessed through binoculars was a badly damaged German submarine, which must have suffered a huge explosion. Before the submarine sank, Grant saw only one officer standing on the deck, staring out to sea, seemingly not in panic, but strangely calm. Grant's men did their job, but could not explain why the submarine sank. And then, search ships found no sign of survivors. The UB-65, like a ghost, disappeared completely, taking everyone with it to the bottom of the sea. It was not rediscovered until nearly 90 years later, a piece of forgotten history, hidden by time and sea. This makes one wonder whether this event is just part of a series of mysteries that will never be solved, a lesson in the meaninglessness of life and death, or simply a battle between humans and nature, things beyond our control.